We're studying in our Bible study the kind of survey approach, really so far in the book of Genesis, and talking about human history and talking about really human history based on whose perspective? God's perspective, which is the most important one, right? He created humankind, and so if we're going to get an appreciation for human history from the perspective of the Creator, then the Bible is the source by which we're able to do that. And we've been doing this in a survey approach. In other words, we haven't been stopping and dealing with a lot of detail, but we're trying to give as much detail as we can to keep a flow of history moving forward in the study. And in the first two lessons, we dealt basically from Adam to whom? Yeah, just a little ways past Noah, right? And so we dealt with the beginning of things. We dealt with the problem that enters into the picture with Adam and Eve. What is it? Sin, and it continues to be a problem. It's a problem that manifests itself in a big way with what two individuals? Cain and Abel, right? And then it just progressively gets worse to the point that man's imaginations are evil continually by the time who comes on the scene? Noah. And so then God decides to save mankind through Noah and his family. That's Genesis chapter 6. And so you see then the floods come, and then Noah resides in the ark for a period of time. Then they come out, and then they begin to do what? Multiply the earth again, right? They go back to the original commendation, if you will, or command given to Adam and Eve that they were to be fruitful and multiply. Go plenish the earth with other human beings. And so when Noah and his family come out of the ark, the same basic instruction is given to them, and they begin to fulfill that purpose. It's not long after that then that we run into a situation where mankind is trying to unify, and so much so they want to even try to build something to illustrate their unification and in some ways their own power and ability. And what was that scene? The Tower of Babel, right? And so when you come to the Tower of Babel and you begin to see man trying to elevate himself, we'll just build us a tower and reach into the heavens ourselves. We don't need a God. That's kind of the imagery there. God's not pleased with that, and so what's He do? All right, so for the first time you see languages enter into the picture. You see where God uses language to divide men, and they begin to separate into segments based on who can speak the language that each other are speaking, and that progress in that tower ceases, and the picture of mankind begins to change. Who's the next person on the horizon? Which is really lesson 3, which is where we're headed. Abraham. All right. So, in lesson 3 of our series, we're going to start talking about the importance of understanding this man by the name of Abraham. Now, I have one other question for you before we dive into a discussion about Abraham and his faith and what he means in the overall scheme of God. In fact, we'll slow down a little bit because we'll really not talk about anybody but Abraham and things related to him in this particular lesson. But here's the question. How many years have gone by from Adam to Abraham? Roughly. I'm not going to ask you because I don't know that we could actually give it a pinpointed exact number. So how many years of human history have we covered from Genesis 1 through Genesis 11? Just a little longer, I think, actually. Yeah, you're pushing 2,000 years. Okay, you're pushing 2,000 years of you. So from Genesis 1 to Genesis 11, you're pushing about 2,000 years worth of human history. How much detail does God give us about that 2,000 years? Genesis 1 through Genesis 11. That's what we've got, right? And so we don't have a lot of detail about the way man lived, how he conducted himself, what way he survived in some senses, how it is that he functioned. We really only have this imagery of God creating, God commanding man to go plenish the earth. Then sin enters the picture, and we get that conversation that's very specific of the difficulties and problems that sin creates for mankind. We start getting hints of who? Way out in the future. Okay, we start getting hints of Christ and the need for that remedy to come, and the victorious Redeemer that would ultimately enter the scene. But we don't get a lot of detail about those first 2,000 roughly years of human existence. But then what happens from the time of Abraham forward? things change. We start to get now, once Abraham enters into the picture, we're going to start hearing a lot, not just genealogies of this person begat this one, and that one begat that one, and begat that one, and begat that one, and begat that one, and there's the history. We're actually going to talk about the individuals and people that kind of fill that timeline up now. And so from Genesis chapter 12, really, clear through the rest of the book of the Old Testament, we're going to get much more detail about the events and circumstances as it relates to God and His interaction with mankind, and in particular in this lesson, His interaction with Abraham. So let's go into Genesis chapter 11 for a moment. At the very end of it, Genesis chapter 11, verse 27. Genesis chapter 11 and verse 27. Now these are the generations of Terah. Who's Terah? That's Abraham's father. Okay, so Tower of Babel, now this genealogy begins, and they say this is, by the way, let me back in one more. Who is he connected to? Who's this history from? Shem, that's right. Whoever said that, it's Shem. Okay? And so we have turned our attention to very specifically Shem, and then very specifically to Terah. And Terah had how many sons listed here? 3. First he had Abraham, then Nahor, and then Haran. Now, what's interesting is that Haran is whose father? We know him from this Lot. Okay, so when we talk about Lot and his involvement with Abraham, don't forget that Lot is the nephew of Haran. But the challenge here, not challenge, but the difficulty of this circumstance is Haran appears, and I'm going to draw this conclusion, he appears to be in what chronology as it relates to these sons? He'd be last, right? He's the youngest. You would name them in order. And so Abraham being the oldest, and then Haran coming at the end. But by the time all of the events surrounding Abraham really begin to kick into gear, where's Haran? He's deceased. Okay? He's deceased. But interestingly, there's a place that's what? Named after him. And so when you think about Haran, apparently he rose to prominence enough to have a city named after him, or maybe they did that posthumously as Abraham eventually ends up there with his father. But this is a prominent family that we're dealing with here. These are folks that have connections to various things, and Haran even very specifically. And I think that's important when we begin to discuss how Abraham is challenged to leave his kindred and leave his country and to leave that which is comfortable and familiar. It's not like he was roughing it. And so it wasn't any big deal for him to leave those things. He was in a family position of prominence that would have made it as comfortable as it could have been in that culture. And yet that's what he had to leave when he goes out and to find a land that God would show him. So here's this picture. So Haran dies before his father Terah in the land of his nativity, in the Ur of Chaldees. And so Abram takes a wife, Nahor takes a wife, and Nahor and his family begin to multiply, but Abraham and Sarah don't have any children at this point in time. And so Terah takes Abram, his son, and then Lot, the son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarah, and they go forth from the Ur of Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan. And they came unto Haran, and they dwelt there. And the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. So if you did some quick math, I think it said that Abraham was born when Terah was how old? You may notice it. 75, right? And this occurs here in chapter 12. We're going to see that when Abraham heads on, he was how old? He was 75 if you read ahead a little bit. So that's 150 years, but we know that Terah lived how long? 205 years. So what's the point, Brian? My point is, Abraham leaves a comfortable place family of prominence. Brother's got a city named after him. That's where they're living at the time that he ultimately begins to really head into the promised land. And he leaves his father for 55 years when he does that. As Terah stays behind. And Abraham, so if Terah was 75, and then add 75, because that's how old Abraham was when he finally leaves Terah behind. He goes in and heads on into the promised land, so that's 150. But Terah was 205 when he dies. And so there's a 55-year span, if my math is correct, between the time that Abram leaves. And so when he says, leave your country, he's leaving a country of comfort. When he says, leave your kindred, it includes who? His father. Okay. And I just wanted us to get that imagery out of Genesis chapter 11 before we go into the challenges and the promises that are made to him in Genesis chapter 12. And so the early chapters of the Bible tell of man's struggle with sin. And then we ultimately come to Abraham, who's going to be this example of obedient faith. And yet his ultimate purpose is to bring whom? He's going to bring the Redeemer, Christ, to save mankind. And what's interesting about that, to me, is that, notice the author of the workbook as well said, no nation upon the earth was deemed suitable for this honor. God would build a nation from scratch and establish a unique relationship with them. In other words, you don't see God saying to Abraham, well, because you came from this lineage and then this lineage and then this lineage and then this lineage, I'm going to use that heritage. No, it's you're the beginning point, Abraham. I'm starting new, a fresh nation, a new nation, and they're going to be coming from you, and you're going to be the patriarch. So God didn't use something that already existed to bring Jesus in a sense then. He brings something absolutely brand new as it relates to Abraham and the purposes that he would have. But here's the thing. Is Abraham, though he's faithful, though he's going to step out on God's promises, is Abraham immune from the problem that has been around since Eve and Adam chose to eat of that fruit? No, Abraham is not immune from that. Abraham has the same temptations, challenges, difficulties. Even though he's a righteous man, even though he's a great man of faith, he still faces the same kind of difficulties. And to illustrate that, the writer of the workbook jumps us a few chapters, and then he'll bring us back. But he jumps us to Genesis chapter 20. What's the scene in Genesis chapter 20? Okay, so why? So they're traveling. Why are they traveling? Okay, so because there's a famine, right? And so they lose faith and confidence. So they begin and they come into this country, and it has a whom? A king. His name is Abimelech, king of Gerar. And he sees this traveling company coming down through, and as I suppose culturally many of the kings in that time did, they would take whatever wives they would choose from those folks. And so he sees Sarah and decides that he'll take her as his wife. And when he inquires, both really Abraham and Sarah basically say, she is my sister, which is half the truth. It's half the truth. But it's not really the truth. And it's going to create consequences. So what's God do? Fast forward a little bit. To Abimelech. Okay, comes to him in a dream. It's really a what? Yeah, it's really a nightmare, right? It's really a nightmare when you think about it. Because he says, God came to Abimelech, verse 3, in a dream by night and said to him, behold what? Thou art a dead man. That doesn't sound like flowers and unicorns, right? That sounds like a much scarier kind of experience to have. When God comes to him in a dream by night, you're a dead man. Why? Well, for the woman you have taken, she is a man's wife. But Abimelech had not come near her. And he said, Lord, wilt thou slay also a righteous nation? Are we all going to be in trouble here? Because I was deceived. She said she is my sister. And she even herself said it. He is my brother. And in the integrity of my heart and innocency of my hands have I done this. What do you want from me? I guess is really what Abimelech is saying. I took them at their word. That when I took her as one of my wives, that he was telling the truth. That this was my sister, or his sister. But fortunately, and I suppose in the providential care of God in some ways as well, because the promise is still in effect, that God wants to bless all nations through Abraham and his seed, they've yet to have Isaac, right? They've yet to have that child. And so here Abimelech says, listen, I didn't what? I'm touched her. Will you slay me and the whole nation when I really haven't done anything, and they deceived me to begin with? And God says to him, I know that thou didst this in the integrity of thy heart, for I also withheld thee from sinning against me. So God says, I took care of that to make sure this didn't become a bigger problem. Therefore suffered I thee not to touch her. Now therefore restore the man and his wife, for he is a prophet, and he shall pray for thee. Thou shalt live, and if thou restore her not, know thou that thou shalt surely die, thou and all that are thine. And so the warning comes, but none of that would have been necessary if Abraham had told the truth. And so Abraham, though righteous, though faithful, though going to be used in the purposes of God in very specific ways, isn't immune from the very problem that happens in the origins. And here's, I think, the practical lesson for us. Even righteous, faithful people falter, fail. Now, the beauty of Abraham is he picks himself up, he takes the correction that comes from God, he gets Sarah, and he gets back to where it's supposed to be. And if we'll do the same, God will honor us again as well. We don't have to remain in that guilty state of sin. You can be faithful and righteous again, and yes, you can be faithful and righteous and stumble at times. Because that's what often sin does to many. And so, again, Abraham was not immune from that. So if you've got your questions, look at them real quick as we just think about Abraham and that circumstance we just read about and studied about. So where was Abraham's original homeland? Yeah, that was Ur of Chaldees, eventually in Haran. What sin did Abraham commit against Abimelech and God? He lied. But here's the interesting part, and we caught it a little bit in the narrative. But how does God describe Abraham? He's a what? He's a prophet. And so it's one of those times where God kind of identifies how we might view Abraham. And God says, that's my prophet that you have there. You've got his wife. You call for him. He'll pray about this. And you let her go. And we'll resolve this issue. Which is exactly what ultimately happens. So Abraham is not immune, again, from those same challenges that others were facing as well. So jump back now to chapter 12. And now that we've illustrated... Dropped it and broke it. Yeah, go ahead, Pam. I'm listening. And a detailed accounting of, and I've always paralleled them, but I could be mistaken on that you've got a detailed account. But there could have been, and I'd have to go back. I did not look timeline, and I should have anticipated that question, and I apologize. But in my mind, they were always parallel. But that, again, I'm just talking about off the cuff because I didn't look detailed at the timeline. So Abraham ultimately now is going to leave home, and He's going to go into this far country. Now, what's interesting about that is, where do we learn a lot about that from? Or at least some things. Yeah, and in the book of Acts, because who talks about it? Stephen does. When Stephen's about to be stoned to death, if you recall, what he does is he goes back and he examines their own history with them and basically challenges them, are you really going to put me to death? And have that consequence come when you've been guilty of this for a long, long period of time. But notice, and said to him, verse 3, get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred, and come into the land which I will show thee. And then came he out of the Chaldeans and dwelt in Charan in that Greek translation from. And from thence, when his father was dead, he removed him into this land wherein ye now dwell. Now, go back and think about that for a minute. So, if you read what Stephen says, he said that he came out of the land of Chaldeans and dwelt in Haran, and from thence when his father was dead, he removed him into this land wherein ye now dwell. Now, think about that for a minute, though. Abraham was born when Terah was 75. Genesis chapter 12 says, and I apologize because nope, it came back good. That the Lord had said to Abram, get thee out of thy country, from thy kindred, and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee, and I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. I will bless them that bless thee, curse them that curse thee. So Abram departs, verse 4, as the Lord had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him, and Abram was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. So, either Stephen is mistaken about something, right? Did you catch that? What's the challenge? Okay, so Stephen says that Abraham didn't leave Haran until his father was dead, but Genesis account says that Abraham left when he was 75. So how's that work? What are y'all looking at me for? I'm asking the questions. Well, let me ask you this. Which one of these two authors, Stephen and Moses, is attempting to talk about the historical record in the moment? In the moment. Okay, so Moses is trying to give a historical documentation of what actually happened in the moment. Okay, he wasn't there. I'm not saying in the moment that he was there, but I'm saying he's trying to talk about the history as it happened in very generic form, right? Okay, because we have these moments where he talks about here's something that happened generically, and then we find out more detail about it later. Genesis written that way, right? In chapter 1, we learn about the days of creation in what form? Generic. Chapter 2, you learn about the days of creation in detail, right? Not two separate accounts of what happened, but a generic account, a general account, and then a specific account. I don't know that Stephen is attempting to try to give us a chronological timeline. What I believe Stephen is trying to do is remind them of their history and trying to challenge them to think about, before you put me to death, I want you to remember, here's all the bad things that we've done to prophets and people that have tried to honor God throughout our history. He's not trying to be historically accurate. That's the point I'm trying to make. Stephen is attempting to convince an audience of people that why do you want to follow the same pattern of evil behavior that your fathers had done? Moses, on the other hand, is trying to give us an account of who, when, and where. That's not what Stephen's trying to do. Stephen's trying to convince an audience of how evil these folks were. So either Stephen is generalizing history for the purpose of trying to prove a point about what evils have been done, or Moses is generalizing history and makes no notation of the fact that he actually waited another 55 years. Moses seems to be the one that's interested in what? And numbers. Go back. Now let's go back. And I share this with you because this is one of those narratives that you and I, if we get into somebody who wants to challenge the Bible, this is one of those contradictory texts that they'll drag you to and take you to and say, look right here. One says this and the other says that. And either we let that be faith-shattering or we come to some reasonable conclusion about why that would be. But again, Stephen is not interested in not discussing. Notice it throughout that. He's talking about how the evils were going on and the difficulties were going on. He is not talking about dates, times, and places in the same sense that Moses was recording for us. And so he's just talking about events and people as it relates to difficulties and challenges within their history. Moses, on the other hand, says, when Terah was 75, he had Abraham. When Abraham was 75, he leaves Haran to head to the promised land. Moses is attempting to give us time, dates, and chronology. Stephen's not. He's just basically saying, listen, back in the days of Abraham, he's back there in the days of Haran, and he's trying to honor what God wanted from him, and he's looking for an inheritance that is to come, a possession, a land possession, a seed promise that's on the horizon. Stephen's generalizing history. His effort is not to try to give some kind of specific chronology of history. Moses is. And that's the difference I see between the two. Now, I guess you could also potentially argue that what? That when he leaves Haran, well, you might say, well, his father was with him. Well, that can't be with Stephen either, right? Because Stephen said he died where? He died in Haran. Okay. Or the other thing you might argue is that when the promise comes in Genesis chapter 12, okay, when the promise comes in Genesis chapter 12, let me get you back to that text. And these discussions surrounding it, that maybe he doesn't depart immediately when he's 75. And then it might be 55 years later. But that doesn't seem to be the language of Moses, does it? Language of Moses seems to be pinpointing exactly when somebody was born, when somebody left, and when somebody did something else. Not Stephen. Stephen isn't attempting to try to define times in chronology. He's trying to prove a point. And that's unless you've got something better than that, that's the best answer I can provide for you. That Stephen's effort was not to give a chronology of time. Moses was. And so I'll rely upon Moses for history. I'll take Stephen's word when it comes to the evils and difficulties and challenges that were arriving. But I don't have a better answer for that, by the way. I don't even know whether you noticed it. Maybe I shouldn't have brought it up. We could have left it alone. I've been all right. But you'll come across folks. And if you just left it at face value and were unwilling to be reasonable at all, then you could make a pretty good argument that there seems to be a problem between those two narratives. And either we're willing to accept the idea that Moses is the one that was interested in history and its chronology, and Stephen was trying to prove a point, or we can say there's a contradiction. But if we do, then that opens up an enormous can of worms after that. Thoughts, questions, things I missed, something you saw? And here's the tricky part. I'm trying, and I did. We got enough time, I guess. But here's the thing. Who is inspired in the book of Acts? Be careful how you answer that. Luke. Thank you. Perfect answer. Luke is the inspired one, right? Because he's the one recording it. So all Luke does is record what who? What Stephen said in that moment. It is not about Stephen being inspired to give us a piece of Old Testament history. Luke is the one inspired to write the book of Acts. He simply says what Stephen says, and that doesn't necessarily mean Stephen has to be right on the money. Have you ever sat in a class like this and you know pieces of the history, but you get something turned or flipped, or you get something in your mind, and if you're just trying to recall it, now I want you to think about this. Not only are you sitting in a Bible class trying to recall the history, but now instead you're standing in a crowd of people and trying to recall that history. Well, let's go one more step. You're in a crowd of people that want to what? Want to stone you to death. And you're trying to recall human history. That's Stephen. That's what Stephen's doing. He's trying to use his memory to teach and explain to these folks how they're just falling prey to the same difficult human behaviors that their ancestors had been befallen by. Stephen not necessarily speaking by inspiration. Stephen speaking off the cuff. And Luke is simply recording the words of Stephen in that circumstance. There are other men who are quoted in Scripture who weren't what? Who weren't inspired. That what they said doesn't necessarily mean that's God's stamp of approval or contradiction. They're simply recorded as to what they said in a particular circumstance.
Also, not every word that God ever uttered to every man on every occasion is written down.
Yeah.
I mean, he could have spoken to Terah at a certain time. He could have spoken to Abraham at other times. And we only know one account in Genesis, and you hear the other account in Acts.
Yeah.
So, we can't say that God didn't do it because he did.
And I think that's a possibility. Again, I still think there's just simply a disconnect, or not disconnect. That's not even the right word. But we just need to understand the perspective by which Stephen is writing, and the perspective by which the inspired man Moses is writing, and what the reason behind it is, and there certainly could have been moments where God spoke to somebody that just didn't simply get recorded for us in that fashion. Any other thoughts, questions? How many of you even saw it, thought of it, considered it? All right. I should have left it alone. Anyway. But I'm telling you, you'll run into somebody at some point in your life. You have enough Bible discussions, you're going to run into somebody at some point. And if they know anything about trying to disprove the Bible, they're going to run to Genesis 12 and Acts chapter 7. And they're going to show you that. And you're going to have some kind of reasonable response to that, or we'll look pretty silly. That we can't provide any kind of response or answer to why that discrepancy is there.
We could do the same thing if we're telling someone about the market. Somewhere along the line you make a mistake, and they'll know your family. They'll know your family. Then they come back and go, whoa, wait, you missed something right there.
Yeah. And Tom, that's the point. We have and can and will do and make the same mistake Stephen did. Because his effort is not to be an inspired man giving the inspiration of God. He is a man about to be stoned to death, throwing a history lesson at folks as fast as he can do it. And that's the difference between him and Moses and the perspective they bring to that situation. All right, so back then to Genesis chapter 12. So the first record of the promise being made to Abraham happens here. And what's basically the two promises that are made? Okay, I'll make you a great nation, and I'm going to give you the land. I apologize for skipping questions 4 through 6, but we kind of answered them anyway. So I'm going to give you a great nation, and in Abraham, all the actually, let me back you up. The land promise comes later. The first promise is, I'll make a great nation from you. The second is, all the families of the earth would be blessed from you. Those are the first two pieces of the puzzle of the promises that are given. The land promise is added a little later. In verse 7 of Genesis chapter 12, you see that land promise would come. But the issue is, who's residing there presently? Canaanites. But we learned in our earlier study that what did God say about those Canaanites? Yeah, they were going to serve. They were going to serve others. And so ultimately, even though they might be possessors of that land presently, God's already spoken about the Canaanites and what would be eventually befall them. And so ultimately, they'll be able to go in and begin to dwell in the land. I thought it was interesting. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 9 defines Abraham as a what? As a sojourner. Now think about that. All these great promises, right? All the nations of the world are going to be blessed through your seed. There's going to be a great nation that comes forth from you. And then even a land promise is made in verse 7 of Genesis chapter 12. But Abraham, even though it's not about ownership. It's not about elevation. When you think about somebody who has great power and prestige and ownership, that guy will come later in the form of Solomon, right? When you think of Solomon, you think of a guy who owns palaces and homes and all kinds of things. Abraham really didn't own anything. Abraham was a sojourner in that very land of promise, even at his death. If you jump forward into Genesis chapter 23, you find that all he basically has is what? A burial place. It's all he really possesses. Sarah eventually buried it, and then he ultimately, but he doesn't possess that land in the sense of any kind of personal benefit. Abraham goes and possesses the land as God's promises were given, and his people, that nation that would rise up behind him, would be ultimately the ones who would gain the benefit, would ultimately always be in the hands of God. How did the requirement then for Abraham to leave his homeland and kinfolk bear upon God's promise to build a nation from his descendants? That's question 7. Yeah, that'd be where you're supposed to be in the right moment in time. This is a special people that are going to come anew, right? This isn't. We're going to use a nation of people that had already existed, but we're going to start this fresh. And all those things had that newness, if you will, was there. And you see that really in picture form as well, because he's going to be the predecessor to whom ultimately? Christ, and that's going to be a newness as well when that nation, under the leadership of Jesus, gets ushered in. Where's Abraham when God first promises to give Canaan to his descendants? Okay. So I'm hearing Haran, I'm hearing Bethel. Okay, let's look. I didn't write down. I wrote the answer down, but I didn't write where. If you go look at, say it again. Yeah, that's what I was looking at. In verse 6, he says, and Abram passed through the land unto the place of Sychem, unto the plain of Morah, and the Canaanite was then in the land. And the Lord appeared unto Abram and said, unto thy seed will I give this land. And so I wrote the plain of Morah is what I put. Are there other translations that are changing that name? Shechem, right. All right. So then he clarifies this promise. So he makes it in chapter 12, and it's going to come back in chapter 13. So Abraham, and Lot, they've got some issues. What do? They separate. Okay, so Abraham and Lot, there's some divisiveness between their herdsmen. Abraham doesn't want any squabbling, so they're going to separate, and gives Lot first pick, and he can choose wherever he wants to go. And then God told Abraham to survey the land all around him. For all the land which you see I give to you and your descendants forever. Genesis 13, 14, and 15. They're going to be like what, according to verses 15 and 16 of Genesis 13? Like the dust of the earth. And these things, as noted in the outline, are not just God's knowledge of the future, but He would make His promises a reality. When God says this is what's going to happen, Abraham, God then puts into motion and does all the work necessary to make sure that actually occurs. He doesn't make a promise and then tell Abraham, okay, I've given you a promise, now go make it happen. He makes a promise to Abraham, and then God stays there every step of the way, making sure that all things necessary can come to pass as it relates to that. So at the time of Abraham and Lot's parting, Abraham is still struggling to make a living in Canaan. No, that's false, because Genesis 13:2 says he has what? Yeah, lots of livestock, right? Lots of animals, the narrative says. What phrase describes Abraham's manner of life in Genesis 13:4? He called upon the name of the Lord. Abraham, though great promises have been extended, though he's been elevated to this position of all the world's going to be blessed because of you, you think about that. It's hard for human beings to remain humble when accolade after accolade, promise after promise, gift after gift is extended. It would have been very easy for Abraham just to kind of let that puff him up and kind of just begin to believe that he was somebody within himself. But it's apparent that Abraham stays grounded. He builds an altar. He's continually offering his praise and worship before God. He's continuing to call upon the name of the Lord. Abraham hasn't forgotten. Though these promises are tremendous and the benefits they're going to bring are tremendous, he doesn't forget how it is that he's going to have those things. Yeah. So Abraham, like many of us, often sometimes need reaffirmed, recommitted, encouraged. And Abraham wasn't any different. And so as time passes by, there's a problem. What is it? You're going to bless all the world, your seed. What happens though? Don't have a child. All these great promises sound wonderful, but at the end of the day, the years are coming and going, coming and going, and coming and going. When you make that promise, I was what? 75. According to Moses' record, I was 75 years old. So I'm already, I'm already in some senses old. When I heard that promise, I was as old as think about that for a second. Yeah, as old as my father was when I was born. And so he shouldn't have any great concern in some senses, right, that it's possible initially. Because his father was 75 when Abraham was born. But as time comes and goes, it becomes more and more challenging for them. And concerning, particularly, that they would remain childless. But God in verses 4 and 5 of Genesis 15 reaffirms that original promise. Your descendants are going to be great. And they're going to inherit that promised land of Canaan in verses 7 and 8. And then he gives him a vision. And I want to look at that for a minute, because I don't know that we spend a lot of time talking about this moment when God kind of gives him an idea of some things that are out into the future, and yet they're still pretty sobering when you think about it. So here in Genesis chapter 15, God reaffirms those promises, but then he comes to him in a dream. Deep sleep falls on Abraham in verse 12, and lo, an horror of great darkness fell upon him. And he said unto Abram, know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. Who is that, by the way? In the days of in the days of the Egyptian bondage. And so long before Moses and long before Joseph and long before that Egyptian bondage ever actually happens, Abraham's already seeing it being revealed to him. Abraham that was called what? In chapter 20, when he was dealing with Abimelech, called a prophet. So God's revealing things to him about what's to come with this nation of people. And it's not always going to be great. And they're going to be servants of others. And there's going to be affliction. He even defines how long it would be, 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge. And afterwards shall they come out with great substance. So in one minute it's scary to think about. You're going to have a great nation, but they're going to have a 400-year period where they're in bondage to others. But here's the weird, it's an odd word, but here's the odd part about that. When they come out of slavery, they're actually going to have what? Yeah, they're going to have great substance. They're going to have a lot of stuff. You think about that entourage of folks that are coming out of the land of Goshen. Remember, they were blessed there. Though they were slaves and in bondage to Egypt, they were the part of the nation that continued to be blessed and have benefit. And so when they come out of that, they're going to have great substance, and they're going to be able to come back. Thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace. Thou shalt be buried in a good old age. But in the fourth generation they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. And so he sees this vision. He talks about the slavery that they'll encounter, but he'll talk about the benefit. He's coming just giving Abraham a couple of glimpses. They don't look promising and great initially, but God says they'll come out the other side better. They'll come out with some substance, and it may take some while. They're going to, when they come into that promised land, to return to it, and they have to retake it. There are going to be some issues. Some of the foes aren't going to be as easily overcome. It's going to take some time to make that happen, but it's going to happen, Abraham. Difficulty's coming. Hardship's going to come. Benefit will come out the other side, and they'll eventually repossess and live in the land of promise again. And what I simply take from that is that God wants Abraham to know ahead, and then that gets recorded in the history, that though he makes these promises, everything's not always going to be what? Perfect and easy and simple. And just because God chose them as a nation doesn't mean everything's going to be as simple and easy as it can be. There are going to be hurdles and challenges and difficulties that have to be met every step of the way. Yeah. And the benefit of his promises is, in relationship to Gary, to that, I'll take you to Genesis 15:18. In the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, unto thy seed have I what? Have I given thee? Have I given this land from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates? And so difficulty, yes. Problems occur, yes. Hardship, yes. But all in all, I'm going to maintain the promise. I'm going to keep the promises that I've given you. And in many senses, because of that, they already possess it. It's already been given. Stated as fact. Same kind of language, by the way, that was used when Moses and them were standing on the doorstep of the promised land, and they send those 12 spies in. God tells Moses, pick you out these spies and let them go spy out the land that I have given you. Same language that's being used right here. Okay, Lord willing, we'll come back. Lessons 4 through 6, I'll set them out on the table back there. I made 3 lessons worth, and you can grab those in the back.